Picture this. You're flying cargo over the Arctic Circle when your instruments go haywire. The Aurora Borealis dances above, but something's wrong. The lights pulse in patterns too perfect to be natural. Your cargo manifest says environmental sensors, but the weight matches military hardware. Welcome to tonight's story, where the beautiful northern lights hide a weapons program so classified that even acknowledging its existence could land you in federal prison. Before we dive into Mason Fry's dangerous discovery, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're loving these late-night journeys into the shadows of truth, hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, kill your lights, settle in, and prepare for a story that will make you question every government environmental project you've ever heard about. Act 1. The Ordinary Job. The de Havilland DHC-5. Buffalo's engines roared against the Arctic wind as Mason Fry guided the old cargo plane through another milk run to nowhere. At 29, he'd traded the structured chaos of Air Force logistics for the supposedly simpler life of civilian freight. But the routes up here, supply runs to research stations scattered across the Canadian Arctic, sometimes made him wonder if he'd actually left military service at all. Yellowknife Control, this is Caribou 779, currently at flight level 180, approximately 200 nautical miles out from Aurora Station. Mason spoke into his headset, the familiar routine of position reports keeping him grounded in the endless white below. Roger 779. Weather holding steady, winds from the northwest at 30 knots. Aurora Station reports ready to receive. Aurora Station. In the 6 months since Mason had started flying for North Star Logistics, he'd made this run twice a month. Officially, it was a joint US-Canadian renewable energy research facility, part of the big push toward Arctic sustainability. The press releases talked about revolutionary methods to harness the Aurora Borealis itself, electromagnetic induction on a massive scale, turning the northern lights into humanity's newest power source. It sounded like science fiction, which is probably why most people dismissed it as another government boondoggle, throwing money at impossible dreams while practical problems went unsolved. But Mason had learned to pay attention to details during his Air Force days, and Aurora Station set off every instinct he'd developed loading classified cargo onto C-130s in Afghanistan. The manifest for today's flight was typical of what had been making him uneasy. 3 pallets of atmospheric monitoring equipment that required reinforced tie-downs typically used for armoured vehicles. 4 crates labelled renewable energy components with handling instructions warning against electromagnetic interference. And most curious, a single container marked only with a NATO stock number and the words "Technical Manual Set. Classified handling required." Since when does renewable energy research need classified technical manuals? Mason muttered to his co-pilot Derek Chen, who'd been flying Arctic routes for 15 years. Derek shrugged, focused on monitoring the instruments. Government contracts, man. They classify their toilet paper if they could bill extra for it. But as they descended toward Aurora Station's ice runway, Mason noticed something he'd been tracking for months. His instruments always acted up at exactly the same point in the approach, roughly 5 miles out. The magnetic compass would spin lazily. The radio would fill with static that had an almost rhythmic quality, and the GPS would briefly show their position as somewhere in the South Pacific, before snapping back to reality. The station itself looked unremarkable from the air, a collection of prefab buildings connected by enclosed walkways, some communication towers, and what appeared to be a large solar panel array. But Mason had noticed things. The solar panels were angled wrong for optimal sun exposure at this latitude. The communication towers were too numerous and too varied for a simple research station. And then there were the tyre tracks. Heavy vehicle tracks led from the main cargo receiving area, not to the visible buildings, but to a low mound about 300 metres away. The tracks disappeared at the mound's base, suggesting an entrance hidden beneath the snow. Every delivery the tracks were fresh. but Mason had never seen the vehicles that made them. After landing and supervising the offload, the Aurora station crew always insisted on handling the cargo themselves with their own equipment. Mason took his usual walk to stretch his legs while Derek handled the paperwork. The station personnel were friendly enough, but had the kind of studied casualness that reminded him of intelligence officers he'd encountered at forward operating bases. They answered questions without really saying anything, smiled without warmth, and always seemed to be watching even when looking away. This time Mason wandered closer to the mysterious mound. As he approached, he felt a vibration through his boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from deep underground. His phone, which had been showing no signal, suddenly blazed to life with full bars before immediately dying. Its battery drained from 60% to 0 in seconds. "You should stick to the marked paths," a voice said behind him. Mason turned to find a woman in Aurora station gear, her badge identifying her as Emily Reeves, Site Safety Coordinator. "Permafrost out here can be unstable. Wouldn't want you falling into a crevasse." Mason looked at the flat, solid ground around them. Right, crevasses. Emily's smile was professional. "The Arctic is full of hidden dangers, Mason. Best to stay where it's safe." That night, back in Yellowknife, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that Aurora Station was wrong in ways that went beyond suspicious cargo and hidden entrances. He'd been to legitimate research stations. Scientists were usually eager to talk about their work, proud to show off their equipment. Aurora Station's personnel acted like they were guarding state secrets, which Mason was beginning to suspect they were. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Aurora Station. The official website was slick and professional, full of stock photos of wind turbines and solar panels, with vague descriptions of cutting-edge electromagnetic research and sustainable Arctic development. But when he dug deeper, things got interesting. The station had been established in 2019, but the land lease went back to 1987, originally designated for a communications research facility that was apparently never built. The primary contractor wasn't a renewable energy company, but Atlas Defense Solutions, a firm Mason recognised from his Air Force days. They specialised in electronic warfare systems. His phone rang, showing an unknown number with a Virginia area code. "Mason Fry?" The voice was professional, crisp. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knows you've been asking questions about Aurora Station. Questions that could be misinterpreted. I'm calling as a courtesy, military to military. Some doors are better left unopened." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. You have a good job, a clean record, a future. Don't jeopardise that over curiosity about things that don't concern you." The line went dead. Mason stared at his phone, then at his laptop screen showing Atlas Defense Solutions Board of Directors, 3 former Pentagon officials and a retired Air Force general who had overseen strategic defense initiatives. Whatever Aurora Station was really doing up there in the Arctic, it had nothing to do with renewable energy. Act 2. The Anomaly. 2 weeks later, Mason was nursing a beer at the Gold Range, Yellowknife's infamous Strange Range bar, when Tobias Winters slid into the booth across from him. Tobias was what the locals called a radio rat, a ham radio enthusiast who spent his nights listening to signals bouncing off the ionosphere, talking to strangers on the other side of the world from his cabin 20 miles outside town. "You're the pilot who flies to Aurora Station," Tobias said. It wasn't a question. "One of them, yeah." Tobias leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement Mason associated with conspiracy theorists and true believers. "I need to show you something, but not here." An hour later, Mason stood in Tobias's cabin, surrounded by enough radio equipment to stock a small broadcast station. Vintage receivers sat next to modern software-defined radios, their displays dancing with waterfall patterns of received signals. The walls were covered with QSL cards, postcards from other radio operators around the world, and maps marked with red pins and string, tracking something Mason couldn't immediately identify. "Listen to this," Tobias said, adjusting dials on a receiver. Static filled the room, then cleared to reveal a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, but electronic. I started picking this up 3 months ago, always at the same time, 0300 UTC, always from the same direction. He pointed to a map where several string lines converged on a point in Nunavut. Aurora Station. Could be equipment interference, Mason suggested, though he was remembering his instruments going haywire on approach. That's what I thought. But then I noticed the pattern. Tobias pulled out a notebook filled with timestamps and frequency measurements. The pulses correspond exactly to Aurora Borealis activity. When the northern lights are strong, the pulses are strong. When they're weak, the pulses are weak. So they're studying the aurora. That's what they claim to be doing. Studying? Or harvesting? Tobias flipped to another page. I've been tracking unexplained blackouts across the Arctic. Small communities, usually lasting just a few minutes, barely making the news. They follow a pattern. He laid a transparent sheet over a map showing dots connected by lines. Every blackout occurs along a line between Aurora Station and wherever the aurora is most active. Mason studied the map, his unease growing. You're saying they're pulling power from the aurora? Or pushing something through it? Watch this. Tobias turned to a computer, pulling up an audio file. This is a transmission I intercepted last week. It's encrypted, but the header was in the clear long enough to identify the sender and recipient. The screen showed sender, Aurora. Actual, recipient, Chrysalis Command. Chrysalis Command? Mason had never heard the designation. Traced it through signal analysis. The response came from a building in Arlington, Virginia. Officially, it's office space leased to a company called Electromagnetic Solutions International. But check this out. Tobias pulled up a corporate registration. ESI is a wholly owned subsidiary of Atlas Defense Solutions. The same company Mason had identified as Aurora Station's primary contractor. There's more, Tobias continued. My friend in Fort Smith, another radio operator, he's been documenting wildlife deaths. Entire flocks of birds falling from the sky, always during or immediately after the pulses, and look at the dates. Mason compared the lists. Every unexplained wildlife death corresponded to a cargo delivery he'd made to Aurora Station. Whatever you're flying up there, Tobias said, it's not environmental sensors. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those heavy pallets, the classified technical manuals, the underground entrance hidden beneath the snow. At 3 a.m, he gave up and drove to the North Star Logistics warehouse at the airport. The night shift knew him. Didn't question when he said he'd left something in the plane. He made his way to the cargo area where tomorrow's Aurora Station shipment was being staged. Most of the crates were the usual, sealed, labelled with technical descriptions that could mean anything. But one pallet, set apart from the others, made him pause. It was covered with a tarp, but the corner had come loose. Underneath was a cylindrical device about the size of a water heater, made of what looked like copper coiling wrapped around a ceramic core. Stencilled on its side was Resonance Amplifier MK7, and below that, Caution, High Energy Electromagnetic Device. Mason quickly photographed it with his phone, then noticed something else. A shipping label that had partially peeled off, revealing another label underneath. The visible label showed Aurora Station as the destination. The hidden one showed an origin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Nuclear Weapons Division. His phone suddenly grew hot in his hand. The screen flickered, showing impossible error messages before going completely dead. Not powered off. Dead, as if the electronics had been fried. You shouldn't be here, Mason. He spun to find Emily Reeves, the safety coordinator from Aurora Station, standing in the warehouse doorway. She wasn't wearing Arctic gear now, but black tactical clothing that suggested a very different job description. How did you... We've been monitoring you since your first call to Tobias Winters. We know about his intercepts. We know about your research. And we know you just photographed classified defense equipment. So what now? You disappear me? Emily sighed. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, we don't disappear curious civilians. Too messy, too many questions. but you put us in a difficult position. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, connected dots that should have remained scattered. What is Aurora Station really doing?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words. "Have you ever heard of the Carrington event? 1859. A solar storm so powerful it set telegraph wires on fire, made the Aurora visible as far south as the Caribbean." Mason nodded. "Now imagine being able to harness that power to create focused electromagnetic pulses using the Aurora as a natural amplifier, not as a weapon. That's thinking too small. As a communication system that can't be intercepted, can't be jammed, can't be traced. A way to send signals through the Earth's magnetic field itself. The blackouts, the dead birds. Regrettable side effects we're working to minimize. The technology is still being perfected. And if I don't keep quiet, then you'll find your life becoming very complicated. Your employer will discover discrepancies in your flight logs. The DEA will receive an anonymous tip about suspicious cargo movements. Your bank will flag your accounts for potential terrorism financing." Emily stepped closer. "Or you can forget what you've seen, continue flying your routes, and enjoy the substantial raise North Star Logistics is about to offer you to retain such a valued pilot." Mason looked at the resonance amplifier, at Emily, at the warehouse full of secrets heading north. The people in those communities, the ones experiencing blackouts, they don't get a choice in being your test subjects. "No," Emily agreed, "or they don't. But then, when has anyone asked the Arctic's opinion about anything? Mining, drilling, missile tests? It's always been humanity's laboratory for things too dangerous to try anywhere else." Act 3. Following the money. Mason took the raise. He kept flying to Aurora Station, but he also started documenting everything. Every manifest got photographed. Every unusual cargo weight got logged. Every instrument anomaly got recorded. He created encrypted backups, stored on servers in countries with no extradition treaties. And late at night he traced money. North Star Logistics, it turned out, was more interesting than he had expected. On paper, it was a small Canadian freight company, family-owned for 3 generations, but its primary contract, the Aurora Station runs, paid 10 times the market rate for Arctic cargo delivery. The payments came not from the Canadian government or even directly from Atlas Defence Solutions, but through a web of intermediary companies that took Mason weeks to untangle. The trail led to something called the Electromagnetic Defence Initiative, a Pentagon office that officially existed for only 18 months in 1987 to 1988, during the height of Reagan's Strategic Defence Initiative, the Star Wars program. Officially, the office had been disbanded, its research deemed unfeasible. Unofficially, Mason discovered it had been reconstituted under different names every few years, moving between departments, always maintaining a budget that was small enough to avoid congressional scrutiny, but large enough to fund significant research. The current incarnation was hidden in the Department of Energy's budget as the Arctic Environmental Protection Program, $68 million annually, ostensibly for studying the impact of climate change on polar electromagnetic phenomena. Mason found the smoking gun in a General Accounting Office report from 2003, buried in an appendix about cost overruns. A single line item: recovery and analysis of foreign technical materials, Operation Northern Light, location, classified Arctic Site 7. Operation Northern Light. Mason searched for any reference to it, finding only fragments. A mention in a Canadian defence document about joint recovery operations. A redacted Air Force report about anomalous satellite debris. And finally, in a declassified CIA assessment of Soviet military capabilities, a single paragraph. The loss of Cosmos 2341 over the Canadian Arctic in 1987 represents a significant intelligence opportunity. The satellite, believed to be testing experimental electromagnetic pulse technology, broke apart at an altitude of 200 kilometres. Debris field analysis suggests primary payload may have survived re-entry. Recovery efforts should be prioritised. Aurora Station sat directly on the projected debris field of Cosmos 2341. Mason met Tobias at a truck stop 50 miles from Yellowknife, away from any potential surveillance. They're not developing their own technology, Mason explained, showing Tobias his findings. They're reverse engineering Soviet EMP weapons that crashed there in 1987. The Aurora isn't just a power source, it's an amplifier for weapons designed to work with the Earth's magnetic field. Tobias studied the documents. This is beyond what I imagined. If they can weaponize the Aurora itself, they could create targeted electromagnetic pulses anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, knock out power grids, communications, military equipment, and it would look like a natural phenomenon, just a particularly strong interaction between solar wind and the magnetosphere. We need to go public with this. Mason shook his head. With what? Financial records that could be explained as legitimate research funding? Speculation about 30-year-old satellite crashes? They'll deny everything, and we'll look like conspiracy theorists. Then what do? We get proof. Real, undeniable proof. The opportunity came 3 weeks later. A massive solar storm was forecast, the kind that would set the Aurora blazing across the entire Arctic. Aurora Station requested an emergency supply run. They needed additional equipment to take advantage of optimal conditions for renewable energy testing. Mason volunteered for the flight. The cargo was different this time, smaller, more numerous packages, each one marked with radiation warnings and handling instructions that suggested volatile materials. Derek, his usual co-pilot, had called in sick, replaced at the last minute by someone Mason didn't recognise, a quiet man named Johnson who said little and watched everything. As they approached Aurora Station, the instruments didn't just glitch, they went completely haywire. The compass spun like a tornado, the altimeter showed them at negative altitude, and the radio filled with what sounded like voices speaking backwards. Through the cockpit window, the Aurora wasn't its usual curtain of green light, but geometric patterns, almost like circuit boards drawn in the sky. Jesus Christ, Johnson muttered, the first genuine emotion Mason had heard from him. They actually did it. That's when Mason realised Johnson wasn't just a replacement pilot. He was here to observe the test. They landed in near whiteout conditions, the Aurora so bright it cast multiple shadows. The Aurora Station crew worked with unusual urgency, unloading the cargo directly onto vehicles that immediately headed toward the hidden entrance Mason had observed months ago. "I need to check something in the cargo hold," Mason told Johnson. "Thought I heard something shift during that turbulence." Johnson looked sceptical but nodded. "Make it quick." "We're wheels up in 30 minutes. Mason made his way to the cargo hold, then slipped out the rear door. The storm provided perfect cover, visibility down to mere meters. He followed the vehicle tracks toward the mound, the vibration through the ground growing stronger with each step. The entrance was exactly where he'd suspected. A ramp leading down, wide enough for vehicles, concealed by camouflage netting covered with snow. Mason descended. His phone, a new one, wrapped in aluminum foil until now, recording everything. The tunnel led to a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. But it wasn't the size that stopped Mason in his tracks. It was the contents. Arranged in a precise pattern were dozens of the resonance amplifiers he'd seen in the warehouse, all connected by thick cables to a central platform. On the platform was something that clearly didn't belong to any Earth-based military, a spherical device about 3 meters across, its surface covered in Cyrillic text and symbols that looked more like circuit diagrams than writing. Soviet technology, but advanced beyond anything that should have existed in 1987. Scientists and technicians in hazmat suits swarmed around the equipment, making final adjustments. Mason recognized Emily Reeves, now in military fatigues, speaking into a radio. "Chrysalis Command, this is Aurora Actual. We are T-minus 5 minutes from pulse generation. Target coordinates locked. Grid reference, November 7-7. Communications hub at Fort Greely. Pulse duration 3 seconds, expected downtime 15 minutes. Confirm receipt. Fort Greely, home to the US military's missile defense system." Mason recorded everything. the phone's memory filling with evidence of a weapon test disguised as energy research, targeting American military infrastructure. He was so focused on documenting that he almost missed the footsteps behind him. "I really hoped you'd taken our advice," Emily said, flanked by 2 security contractors with rifles. "Now things get complicated." Act 4. The Leak in the Chase. Mason raised his hands, the phone still recording in his chest pocket. "Testing EMP weapons on your own military. That's treason, isn't it?" Emily smiled coldly. "Treason implies working against your country's interests. We're ensuring America maintains electromagnetic superiority in an age where conventional weapons are becoming obsolete. The Fort Greely test is calibrated to create minor repairable disruptions, just enough to test our countermeasures. And the Canadian government? Do they know you're using their territory for weapons testing?" "The Canadians know exactly what we've told them, that we're researching Aurora-based renewable energy. The underground facility doesn't officially exist." A klaxon sounded. "T-minus 60 seconds, an automated voice announced. "You should see this," Emily said, gesturing toward an observation window. "You've risked everything to learn our secret. Might as well witness history." Through the window, Mason could see the central device beginning to glow. The resonance amplifiers hummed in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in his bones. Above, through monitors showing external cameras, the Aurora twisted into impossible shapes. Spirals, grids, focused beams of light that seemed to reach down toward the Earth. 30 seconds. Mason felt his phone growing warm in his pocket, the electromagnetic field beginning to affect its electronics, despite the foil shielding. The Soviet device was supposed to be a doomsday weapon, Emily explained, her eyes fixed on the glowing sphere, able to create a cascade effect through the magnetosphere, knocking out electronics across entire continents. "We've refined it, controlled it, turned it into a precision instrument." 10 seconds. The harmonic vibration reached a crescendo. Mason's vision blurred, his inner ear screaming conflicting information about up and down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pulse initiated. The sphere erupted in light. Not visible light, but something that made every nerve ending fire at once. The monitors showed the Aurora focusing into a column of energy that seemed to punch through the atmosphere itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. "Pulse complete. Chrysalis command confirming target impact. Fort Greely communications offline. Secondary effects minimal. Test successful." The technicians erupted in celebration. Emily turned to Mason with satisfaction. 15 minutes from now, Fort Greely's systems will come back online. They'll blame it on solar storm interference. No permanent damage, no evidence, no questions asked. "Except I have everything on video," Mason said. Emily's smile didn't waver. "Your phone died 30 seconds ago. EMP, even the residual field, is hell on electronics." She gestured to the security contractors. "Take him to holding. We'll figure out what to do with him after the team clears out." As they marched him through the facility, Mason mentally catalogued everything. Escape routes, personnel numbers, equipment details. The holding cell was a repurposed storage room, solid walls, electronic lock. They searched him thoroughly, finding the dead phone, his wallet, keys, even the pen from his flight suit. But they didn't find the micro SD card hidden in the heel of his boot, where he'd transferred the video just before the phone died. 4 hours later, the facility had gone quiet. Skeleton crew only, most personnel evacuated after the successful test. Mason had spent the time working on the door's lock mechanism. Electronic, yes, but with a manual override required by fire code. His Air Force survival training had included a week with a CIA operative who taught them things that weren't in any official manual. The lock clicked open just as he heard footsteps approaching. Johnson, the replacement pilot, stood in the hallway. "We need to leave. Now," Johnson said. "Who are you really?" "Canadian Security Intelligence Service. We've suspected Aurora Station's true purpose for 2 years, but couldn't prove it." Your little adventure gave us the excuse to insert assets. This place will be crawling with Canadian military in 6 hours, but you need to be gone before then." They made their way through the facility, now nearly deserted. Johnson had disabled the security cameras, creating a blind spot in the surveillance. At the motor pool, they acquired a snowmobile, Johnson producing keys from his pocket. "They'll notice we're gone within the hour," Johnson said as they raced across the tundra toward the aircraft. "But there's a problem. Your plane's been disabled. They pulled the control circuit breakers." Mason grinned. "They pulled the ones they could see, DHC-5. Buffalo has redundant systems from its military days, hidden behind the cargo panels. Give me 10 minutes. As Mason worked to restore the aircraft's electrical systems, Johnson kept watch. "You have evidence." Mason tapped his boot. "Everything, but if I release it, they'll destroy me." "Not if it comes from multiple sources simultaneously. I've got my own recordings, and there are others. Scientists who've grown uncomfortable with the weapons application. Military personnel who believe this violates treaties. We release together. They can't suppress it all." The engines coughed to life just as lights appeared on the horizon, vehicles approaching fast. "Go!" Johnson shouted. "I'll delay them." Mason didn't argue. He pushed the throttles forward, the old Buffalo lurching into motion. The ice runway wasn't lit, but the Aurora provided enough illumination. As he lifted off, he saw Johnson's snowmobile racing toward the approaching vehicles, playing chicken with military precision. The flight to Yellowknife was the longest 2 hours of Mason's life. No radio contact. That would give away his position. Flying low to avoid radar, navigating by compass and instinct, expecting at any moment to see fighter jets appearing on his tail. But he made it. At Yellowknife Airport, he didn't go to the North Star hangar. Instead, he landed at the general aviation area, where Tobias waited with a van. "Drive," Mason said, climbing in. "Alaska. I have a contact at Elmendorf Air Force Base who'll help us get this to the right people." As they drove south, Mason uploaded the video to 17 different servers, each with a dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 24 hours, the footage would automatically release to major news outlets, WikiLeaks, and every government oversight committee he could think of. His phone, Tobias's spare, rang immediately. Unknown Virginia number. "Mr. Fry, you're making a serious mistake." It was a new voice, older, with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The only mistake was thinking you could test weapons on Allied facilities without consequences. You don't understand the geopolitical implications. China and Russia are developing similar capabilities. If our research becomes public, it accelerates their programs. Maybe if it's public, there'll be pressure for treaties, for control. You're naive. Release that footage and you'll be charged under the Espionage Act. You'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Only if you can find me." Mason hung up and removed the phone's battery. They drove for 18 hours straight, crossing into British Columbia, then Alaska. At the border, Mason expected trouble, but Johnson had apparently worked magic. Their crossing was smooth, no alerts, no delays. Act 5, The Showdown. Mason's contact at Elmendorf was Captain Sarah Park, an intelligence officer he'd worked with in Afghanistan. She met them at a truck stop outside Anchorage, her expression grim. "Mason, what have you gotten yourself into? There are flash alerts about you on every military and intelligence network. They're calling you a foreign agent, saying you stole classified materials." Mason handed her the micro SD card. "Watch this, then tell me who the real threat is." They sat in her car as she viewed the footage on a secure laptop. Her face went pale as she watched the test, heard Emily's casual admission about targeting Fort Greely. They actually hit our own base? Check the logs for that night. 15-minute communication blackout blamed on solar storm activity. Sarah pulled up the incident reports on her classified network. There it was. Fort Greely. Complete communications failure from 0347 to 0402 local time. Attributed to extreme auroral electromagnetic interference. "They're testing weapons on American military installations," she breathed. "This is beyond illegal. It's an act of war against our own forces. Can you get this to someone who'll act on it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. I know someone at the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Someone who's been investigating black budget programs. But Mason, even with this evidence, they have resources you can't imagine. They'll discredit you, destroy your reputation, possibly worse. Then we don't give them just one target. Mason pulled out a list he and Tobias had compiled. 47 journalists, 12 congressional staffers, 8 foreign intelligence services who'd be very interested to know about an Arctic EMP weapon. We release simultaneously, globally. They can't suppress everyone. That could start a war. Or prevent one. If everyone knows about the weapon, it loses its strategic value. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, then cursed. Military police, heading this way. Someone tracked my vehicle. Through the truck stop window they could see vehicles approaching. Black SUVs, no plates, windows tinted. Back door, Tobias said, already moving. They rushed through the kitchen, startling the cook, and out into the rear parking area. Sarah's personal vehicle, a nondescript Honda, was parked there. "Take my car," she said, tossing Mason the keys. "I'll deal with them. Buy you time." As they drove away, Mason saw in the mirror Sarah walking calmly toward the approaching SUVs, her hands visible, credentials ready. She was sacrificing her career, possibly her freedom for the truth. They drove to a cabin Tobias knew, 40 miles from Anchorage. No cell coverage, completely off-grid. There, using a satellite internet connection that couldn't be traced to the location, they prepared to release everything. But Mason hesitated. "What's wrong?" Tobias asked. "Johnson, the Canadian agent, Sarah, others who've helped us. If we release this, they'll suffer too. Then we're selective. We redact names, protect sources, focus on the technology, the violation of treaties, the tests on allied facilities, make it about the program, not the people." They spent 6 hours editing, redacting, creating a package that exposed the Aurora Directive while protecting those who'd risked everything to help them. At midnight Alaska time, Mason hit send. Within minutes, his satellite connection was severed, but it was too late. The information was out, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The response was immediate and chaotic. The Pentagon denied everything. The Canadian government demanded explanations. Environmental groups seized on the wildlife deaths. Military families questioned whether other equipment failures had been tests. Mason and Tobias waited in the cabin, expecting arrest at any moment. Instead, 12 hours later, Sarah arrived. "You did it," she said, exhausted but smiling. "The Inspector General's office has launched a full investigation. Congress is demanding hearings. The program's been suspended pending review." "What about us?" Mason asked. "Am I going to prison?" "That's the interesting part. Officially, you don't exist right now. No charges have been filed, because filing charges would mean acknowledging what you exposed. You're in legal limbo." A week later, a different kind of visitor arrived at the cabin. Emily Reeves, no longer in military attire, but in civilian clothes that somehow made her look more dangerous. "Congratulations," she said, her tone neutral. "You've set back American electromagnetic defense research by a decade." "I exposed illegal weapons testing," Mason countered. "You exposed a program that would have guaranteed American military superiority for the next century. Do you think China isn't working on the same technology? Russia? They're probably thanking you right now." "Then maybe the solution is transparency, treaties, international oversight." Emily laughed. "You really are naive. But it doesn't matter now. The program's been shut down. The facility's being dismantled. Officially, it was all a failed renewable energy experiment, classified due to the proprietary technology involved. That's the cover story. It's a good one. It explains the secrecy, the military involvement, even the electromagnetic effects. The solar storm that night caused equipment malfunctions leading to false readings. No weapons, no conspiracy, just government incompetence and corporate greed. But we have the video. Deepfake technology is amazing these days, isn't it? Already experts are questioning the authenticity of your footage. In 6 months, it'll be dismissed as an elaborate hoax. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. You won. The program's dead. But you also lost because now we're behind in a race you don't even know is being run. When the next Carrington event happens, and it will, and when someone else's electromagnetic weapons are the only things working afterward, remember that you had a chance to keep America ahead. After she left, Mason and Tobias sat in silence. Did we do the right thing? Tobias finally asked. I don't know, Mason admitted, but we did the only thing we could live with. Act 6. The Aftermath. 6 months later, Mason stood on a hillside in Montana, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. He'd bought a small ranch with the money from selling his story to a documentary filmmaker, though the documentary was marketed as speculative fiction based on true events, the only way to avoid lawsuits. The official story had held. Aurora Station was dismantled, its existence explained away as a failed green energy project that had wasted millions in taxpayer dollars. A few congressional hearings happened, some bureaucrats were reassigned, and the whole thing faded from the news cycle within weeks. But Mason knew the truth hadn't died, it had just gone deeper. His phone buzzed. A new model, heavily encrypted, provided by a whistleblower organisation that had taken interest in his case. The message was from Johnson, the Canadian agent, using their agreed-upon code. Northern fishing trip was successful, caught several large ones. Weather patterns remain interesting. Translation. Canadian intelligence had secured evidence from Aurora Station and was monitoring similar activities elsewhere. Mason's laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Sarah Park, now a civilian after her forced retirement. She worked for an oversight organisation monitoring defence contractors, a watchdog with teeth, funded by tech billionaires worried about military overreach. 3 new renewable energy projects have been proposed, one in Norway, one in Tasmania, one in Patagonia, all in areas with high auroral or electromagnetic activity, all with the same contractor connections we documented. They're not stopping, just spreading out the research to avoid another concentrated target. Mason typed back, "Keep watching, we'll be ready." Tobias had moved to Montana too, setting up his radio equipment in a barn on Mason's property. He spent his nights monitoring the same frequencies, listening for the telltale pulses that would indicate resumed testing. "You know they're going to try again," Tobias said one evening as they watched the Aurora together. "Different place, different cover story, but the same goal." "I know," Mason replied, "but now there are more of us watching. The network Sarah's building, Johnson's contacts, the scientists who've quietly left the program. We changed something." "What?" "The technology's still out there. We changed the conversation. Before, it was a complete black box. Unlimited funding, zero oversight, no questions asked. Now, even if they restart, they know people are watching. They have to be more careful, more limited. And sometimes that's all you can hope for, not to stop something completely, but to slow it down enough that safeguards can catch up." A year after the Aurora Station revelation, Mason received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man, Russian accent thick despite decades in America, introduced himself as Viktor Petrov. "I designed the original device," he said simply. "Cosmos 2341. I defected in 1990, told the Americans everything about the satellite, but they didn't believe me about its full capabilities until it crashed and they recovered it. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 30 years watching them try to weaponize my creation. I designed it as a shield, protection against solar storms, a way to strengthen the magnetosphere. They turned it into a sword." Victor handed Mason a worn notebook, filled with equations and diagrams. "The counter-frequency," Victor explained. "Every electromagnetic weapon has an opposite wave that cancels it out. If they start testing again and broadcast this frequency, it will neutralize the pulse, make their weapon useless. Why didn't you release this yourself? Who would believe an old Russian about American weapons? But you've already proven the truth once. You have credibility I never had." Mason studied the notebook. This could prevent them from ever developing the weapon, or force them to find a different approach, hopefully a less dangerous one. Technology always advances, Mason. The question is whether wisdom advances with it. 3 years passed, The Aurora Directive became a footnote in conspiracy forums, dismissed by mainstream media but kept alive by a dedicated community of researchers. Mason continued flying cargo. Now for a small company he had started himself, serving remote communities across the northwest. He kept his ears open, his contacts active, always watching for signs of renewed activity. Then, on a routine flight to Whitehorse, his instruments went haywire in a familiar pattern. He checked his coordinates, nowhere near any known facility. But below, barely visible through the snow, he glimpsed something that made his heart race. Vehicle tracks leading to a low mound in the terrain, communication towers that shouldn't exist, and the distinctive shimmer of camouflage netting. They'd started again. Different location, probably different country, but the same program. That night, Mason activated the network. Within hours, journalists in 5 countries had the coordinates. Satellite imagery was purchased and analysed. Environmental groups dispatched teams to monitor wildlife. Sarah's organisation filed Freedom of Information requests with 17 different agencies. But this time, Mason also did something different. Using Tobias's radio equipment and Victor's notebook, he broadcast the counter-frequency directly at the site during their next test window. The results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of generating a controlled pulse, the facility experienced what witnesses described as the Northern Lights descending to Earth. A massive, uncontrolled electromagnetic discharge that destroyed every piece of electronic equipment within 5 miles, but, crucially, harmed no one. The facility was abandoned within a week. Emily Reeves made one last visit, finding Mason at his ranch. "That was you," she said. "It wasn't a question. The counter-frequency. You've made the entire concept obsolete." "Good." "You don't understand what you've done. That technology was our best shot at defending against solar storms, against electromagnetic attacks from other nations." "Then develop it openly," Mason interrupted, "with international cooperation, civilian oversight and safety protocols. Stop turning every discovery into a weapon." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that's possible?" "I believe it's necessary. The Aurora belongs to everyone, Emily. The moment you tried to weaponize it, you guaranteed someone would stop you." She left without another word. 2 months later, Mason read about a new international initiative, the Global Electromagnetic Defense Coalition, a joint effort between 12 nations to study and protect against solar storms and electromagnetic phenomena. The project would be based in Antarctica, with full transparency and civilian oversight. Emily was listed as the technical director. Epilogue. 5 years after Aurora Station, Mason stood in a classroom at the University of Alaska, guest lecturing for a course on environmental science and ethics. The professor had introduced him as a cargo pilot, with an interesting perspective on Arctic development. "The Arctic has always been a mirror," Mason told the students. "What we do there, hidden in the ice and isolation, reflects who we really are as a society. We can use it as a laboratory for weapons, or we can use it as a classroom for cooperation." A student raised her hand. "Is it true what they say online? That you exposed a secret weapon program?" Mason smiled. "I exposed what happened when good people convinced themselves that secrecy was more important than accountability. Whether it was weapons or whether research doesn't matter as much as the lesson. Power without oversight corrupts, whether that power is political, military, or electromagnetic." After the lecture, Mason drove to a hillside overlooking Fairbanks. The Aurora was particularly active that night, sheets of green and gold rippling across the sky. His phone buzzed, a message from Tobias. "All quiet on the frequencies, looks like a peaceful night." Mason typed back, "For now, but we keep listening." As he watched the Aurora dance, natural, untamed, unweaponized, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a cargo pilot just trying to make a living, stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and somehow emerged as an unlikely guardian of one of nature's most magnificent phenomena. The Aurora Directive was dead, but Mason knew the impulse behind it. the desire to control, to weaponize, to dominate, would never fully die. There would always be those who looked at the beauty of the Northern Lights and saw only potential military advantage. But now there were also those who watched the watchers, who questioned the questioners, who demanded that some things remain beyond the reach of classification stamps and black budgets. His phone rang. Sarah Park. "Mason, you'll want to see this. New contract just went out for a bid. Something called the Thermosphere Research Initiative. Guess where it's being built?" "Where?" "Greenland. And guess who's listed as a technical consultant?" Mason didn't need to guess. The game was starting again, just with new players and new rules. "Send me everything," he said, "and contact Johnson. Tell him the fishing trip might need to head further north." As he drove back to his ranch, the Aurora continued its eternal dance above, beautiful and dangerous, natural and mysterious. Mason had won one battle, but the war between transparency and secrecy, between weapons and wonder, would continue as long as humans looked up at the lights and dreamed of harnessing heaven. But that was okay. Mason had learned something important in his fight against the Aurora Directive. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but forcing them to play by better rules. The weapons researchers would continue their work, but now they did it knowing that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always ready to broadcast the counter-frequency that would turn their weapons into nothing more than an expensive light show. The Aurora belonged to everyone, and Mason Fry, cargo pilot turned reluctant guardian, would make sure it stayed that way. As he pulled up to his ranch, his radio crackled to life. Tobias's voice, excited. "Mason, you need to hear this. I'm picking up something new. Not pulses this time. It sounds almost like music." Mason smiled grimly and headed for the barn where Tobias kept his equipment. The work was never done, the mysteries never ended, and somewhere in the static between stations, in the frequencies that bounced off the ionosphere, new secrets were waiting to be discovered and, if necessary, exposed. The Aurora danced on, keeper of secrets, canvas for humanity's ambitions, and reminder that some forces of nature should remain forever wild. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet, a vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight joined Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza Plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. "I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones." As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall, "do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations: seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, no ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention: the acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex, a resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous. Very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. "My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here." But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. "Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood?" He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels, When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it. Hassan studied the drawing. You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite. Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. "The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north. It's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where 2 underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance, they had been searching for specific energetic conditions. "Hassan," Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, "your grandfather's stories. Did any of them mention lights?" Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. "Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination?" "No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena." Hassan's eyes widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. "Dr. Chen," she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, "what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released." Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Have there been any attempts to access them? Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. That's where things become political. In 2017, An international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. "It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant. It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically? Millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. "Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery." As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realized he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. "Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price." Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper, affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected, altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realized that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the King's Chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery. It was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, It was a machine for expanding human potential, built by a civilization that understood the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic energy, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. But why had this knowledge been lost, and why were modern authorities so determined to prevent its rediscovery? As dawn approached and the electromagnetic readings began to fluctuate with the rising sun, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his research, and possibly his life. He wasn't going to publish his findings in academic journals where they could be dismissed or suppressed. He was going to find a way to demonstrate the pyramid's true capabilities to the world. The Age of Secrets was about to end. 3 weeks after his night in the King's Chamber, Marcus found himself in a secure conference room at Cairo University, surrounded by researchers who had responded to his carefully worded communications. Dr. Solomon sat across from him, along with Dr. James Morrison, a British archaeoacoustic specialist, Dr. Elena Kozlov, a Russian electromagnetic researcher, and surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a Lakota physicist who studied indigenous sacred sites in North America. "What you're suggesting, Doctor?" "Chen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing Marcus's data on his tablet, "goes beyond revolutionary. You're proposing that ancient civilizations possess technology that we're only beginning to understand." Marcus nodded, pulling up a global map on the room's display screen. Red dots marked locations across every continent. It's not just a proposal anymore. Thanks to Dr. Running Bear's research, we've identified 47 sites worldwide that show identical electromagnetic signatures to the Great Pyramid. Dr. Running Bear leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "My people have always known that certain places were different. We called them places where the earth speaks, the acoustic properties, the electromagnetic anomalies, the consciousness-altering effects. They're all documented in our oral traditions." She pointed to several dots in North America. Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Medicine Wheels of Wyoming, certain kivas in the southwest. They all show the same engineering principles, positioning at electromagnetic convergence points, internal geometries designed for acoustic resonance, materials chosen for their piezoelectric properties. Dr. Kozlov, who had been quietly analysing electromagnetic data, looked up with excitement. "I've been comparing the frequency patterns from these sites. They're not random, they form a harmonic sequence. Each site resonates at frequencies that complement the others, as if they were designed to work together as a single system." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A single system spanning the entire globe. "More than that," Dr. Kozlov continued, pulling up a complex waveform analysis. "If all these sites were activated simultaneously, the combined electromagnetic output would create a standing wave pattern around the Earth. The planet itself would become a resonating chamber." The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus thought back to his experience in the King's Chamber, the sense of connecting not just to the pyramid, but to something vast and worldwide. Had he been tapping into a dormant global network that once linked human consciousness across continents? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else we need to consider. I've been analysing historical records of these sites, looking for patterns of suppression. It's remarkable how consistently ancient knowledge about these places has been discouraged." He brought up a timeline on his laptop. The Library of Alexandria burned multiple times, always targeting texts about natural philosophy and sacred geometry. The Spanish conquistadors systematically destroyed Mayan and Aztec codices that contained astronomical and architectural knowledge. The British Empire consistently relocated indigenous populations away from sites that showed electromagnetic anomalies. Dr. Running Bear's expression darkened. "My ancestors were forced from sacred sites across North America. The official reason was always agricultural development or mineral rights, but they consistently targeted places where consciousness-altering experiences were known to occur." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The same pattern of suppression he'd encountered with the pyramid's hidden chambers was part of a much larger historical trend. Someone, or some group, had been systematically working for centuries to prevent humanity from rediscovering its technological and spiritual heritage. "The question is," Dr. Solomon said quietly, "what would happen if we reactivated this network?" Dr. Solomon's question haunted Marcus for days. The theoretical implications of reactivating an ancient global consciousness network were staggering, but the practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Most of the sites were under government control, protected by restricted access, or surrounded by modern development that would interfere with their electromagnetic properties. But Marcus couldn't let go of what he'd experienced in the King's Chamber. The sense of expanded awareness, of connection to something vast and ancient, had fundamentally changed his understanding of human potential. If that experience could be replicated and shared, it might represent the next stage of human evolution. The answer came from an unexpected source. Hassan appeared at Marcus's hotel room door early one morning, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Doctor, Chen, my family, we have been guardians longer than we have been guides. My great-grandfather, before the British came, before the tourists, he was keeper of the old knowledge." Hassan opened the satchel to reveal documents that made Marcus's breath catch. Hand-drawn maps showing underground passages throughout the Giza Plateau. Detailed diagrams of the pyramid's internal structure, including chambers that weren't on any official archaeological survey. And most remarkably, technical drawings that showed how the pyramid's systems could be manually activated. "The old knowledge, it was never lost completely," Hassan continued. "Hidden, yes. Dangerous to speak of, yes. But preserved by families like mine, waiting for someone who could understand its importance." The drawings revealed that the pyramid's consciousness-amplifying effects weren't automatic. They required specific activation procedures. Water had to be introduced into the subterranean chambers at precise volumes and timing. Certain crystals needed to be placed in the sealed chambers to focus the electromagnetic fields. And most crucially, multiple people had to participate simultaneously, their consciousness working together to achieve resonance with the global network. "Hassan, this is incredible, but how could we possibly implement it? We'd need access to the sealed chambers, permission for extended stays in the pyramid, and coordination with researchers at sites around the world." Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Dr. Chen, who do you think has been maintaining the pyramid systems all these years? The tourist guides, the security staff, the maintenance workers, many of us are descendants of the original guardians. We have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could understand what we have been protecting." Over the next few hours, Hassan revealed the existence of a network of guardians at ancient sites worldwide. Families who had maintained the old knowledge for generations, keeping the sites minimally functional while waiting for the time when they could be fully reactivated. The suppression Marcus had encountered wasn't just from modern governments. It was part of an ancient conflict between those who sought to preserve transformative knowledge and those who feared its implications for existing power structures. "But now," Hassan said, his eyes bright with possibility, "the time of hiding is ending. The world is ready for the old wisdom to return." Marcus spent the next week in secret meetings with Hassan's network. They showed him hidden passages that connected the pyramids at Giza to underground chambers extending for kilometers beneath the desert. They revealed caches of ancient crystals and metallic components that could be used to restore the pyramid's full functionality. Most remarkably, they demonstrated that they had been maintaining contact with Guardian networks at other sites around the world, using methods that seemed to blend ancient wisdom with modern technology. The plan they developed was audacious beyond anything Marcus had imagined. On the night of the next new moon, when electromagnetic conditions would be optimal, Guardian networks at 12 major sites would simultaneously activate their monuments' consciousness-amplifying systems. The Great Pyramid would serve as the primary node, with Marcus and the research team providing scientific documentation of the process. If successful, the experiment would create the first coordinated activation of the global consciousness network in over 3,000 years. The effects, according to the Guardian's preserved knowledge, would be felt worldwide. A sudden expansion of human awareness that could fundamentally alter the course of civilization. But there were risks. The ancient texts spoke of individuals who had been unprepared for the experience, whose consciousness had been overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. There were warnings about the network attracting the attention of forces that had opposed its use in the past, and there was the very real possibility that modern governments would respond to the activation with force, viewing it as a threat to established order. As Marcus stood in the King's Chamber 1 week before the planned activation, surrounded by crystals and metallic components that Hassan's people had been safeguarding for millennia, he realized that he was about to participate in either the most important experiment in human history or the most dangerous. The pyramid hummed around him with renewed energy, its systems responding to the presence of the missing components. Through his consciousness, he could sense the other sites coming online around the world, their guardians preparing for an event that would either herald humanity's next evolutionary leap or mark the end of the Age of Secrets forever. The night of the new moon arrived with unprecedented atmospheric conditions. Aurora activity extended far beyond the polar regions, creating shimmering curtains of light visible even in Egypt's desert sky. Electromagnetic storms disrupted satellite communications worldwide, while seismic monitoring stations detected subtle but synchronized vibrations from ancient sites across the globe. Marcus stood in the King's Chamber surrounded by Hassan's Guardian network and the international research team. The chamber had been transformed. Crystalline structures now occupied the corners, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting the subtle light from their instruments. Copper coils, fashioned according to ancient diagrams, had been positioned to enhance the room's natural electromagnetic properties. Most remarkably, water from the Nile's ancient flood channels had been carefully directed into the subterranean chambers, creating the hydraulic pressure needed to activate the pyramid's piezoelectric systems. Dr. Running Bear checked her communication device one final time. Serpent Mound is reporting full activation. The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded. Dr. Morrison, monitoring from Newgrange and Ireland, transmitted similar reports. The acoustic resonance here is building beyond our measurement capabilities. The entire mound is vibrating in harmony with frequencies we didn't know existed. Around the world, Guardian networks at sites from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat were reporting the same phenomenon. Ancient monuments that had been dormant for millennia were awakening, their consciousness-amplifying systems responding to coordinated activation for the first time in recorded history. In the King's Chamber, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of expanded awareness beginning to build, but this time it was different, stronger, more focused, and connected to something vast beyond individual consciousness. Through the electromagnetic field generated by the activated pyramid, he could sense the presence of people at the other sites, their awareness merging into a collective experience that transcended physical distance. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring the electromagnetic readings, whispered in amazement, "The standing wave pattern is forming exactly as predicted. The Earth's electromagnetic field is reorganizing itself around these sites." But the experience went beyond scientific measurement. As the network reached full activation, Marcus found his consciousness expanding not just across space but across time. He could sense the pyramid builders themselves, not as historical figures but as present awareness, as if their consciousness had been preserved within the structure itself, waiting for this moment of reactivation. The ancient Egyptians hadn't just built a machine for amplifying consciousness, they had created a means of preserving it across millennia. The pyramid was a library of human awareness, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved levels of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach. Through the network, Marcus experienced visions of the ancient world as it had truly been. Not the primitive civilization described in history textbooks, but a global culture connected by consciousness-amplifying technology, capable of feats that seemed magical only because the principles had been forgotten. He saw the construction of the monuments not as slave labour directed by megalomaniacal pharaohs, but as collaborative projects undertaken by people who understood their role in maintaining humanity's connection to higher levels of awareness. Most remarkably, he experienced the reason why the network had been deactivated. As human civilizations became more hierarchical and centralized, the egalitarian consciousness expansion technology had been seen as a threat to emerging power structures. Rulers who depended on controlling information and limiting awareness had systematically dismantled the network. replacing consciousness-expanding wisdom traditions with belief systems that emphasized obedience and separation. The suppression hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, coordinated across cultures and centuries by those who understood that widespread access to expanded consciousness would make traditional forms of dominance impossible to maintain. But the network had been designed with safeguards. The consciousness of its builders had been preserved within the structures themselves, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage. That time, Marcus realized, was now. As the activation reached its peak, effects began manifesting around the world. Dr. Running Bear reported that people living near the activated sites were spontaneously experiencing expanded states of consciousness. Emergency services were receiving calls about strange lights and telepathic experiences. Social media was flooded with reports of sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, and experiences of connection that transcended normal human limitations. But there was resistance as well. Military aircraft were scrambling towards several of the activated sites. Government communications were buzzing with references to unauthorized experiments and potential security threats. The same forces that had suppressed the ancient knowledge were mobilizing to contain its return. Hassan, who had been monitoring communications with Guardian networks worldwide, turned to Marcus with urgent concern. "Doctor, Chen, we have perhaps 30 minutes before official intervention begins. The network is fully activated, but maintaining it will require ongoing commitment from people around the world." Marcus understood. The ancient network hadn't been maintained by technology alone. It had required conscious participation from people who understood its importance. The reactivation was just the beginning. For the consciousness-expanding effects to continue, individuals at sites around the world would need to take responsibility for maintaining the system, despite inevitable opposition from established power structures. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the first military helicopters appeared on the horizon, Marcus made his final recordings. The scientific data would be crucial for documenting what had occurred, but the real proof would be the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that the network had initiated. The age of secrets was truly ending. But as Marcus and his team prepared to face the consequences of their world-changing experiment, he realized that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the Global Awakening, as the media had dubbed it, Marcus sat in a small cafe in Prague, one of dozens of cities where consciousness research centres had spontaneously emerged. Around the world, people who had experienced the network activation had begun gathering, sharing their experiences, and developing new applications for expanded awareness. The official response had been predictable. Governments had classified the event as a coordinated hoax involving atmospheric anomalies and mass suggestion. The Guardian networks had been disbanded, the sites placed under increased security, and several researchers had found their careers and funding mysteriously terminated. But the consciousness genie was out of the bottle. Dr. Running Bear, now leading a consortium of indigenous researchers, had documented over 10,000 cases of enhanced psychic abilities manifesting in people who had been near activated sites. Dr. Kozlov was working with a network of physicists who had detected fundamental changes in quantum field behaviour around former network locations. Even Dr. Morrison, despite losing his university position, continued documenting the ongoing acoustic anomalies at ancient sites worldwide. Most remarkably, people were spontaneously rediscovering consciousness expansion techniques that had been lost for millennia. Meditation practices, acoustic healing methods, and electromagnetic sensitivity training were emerging independently in communities around the globe, as if the network activation had reawakened dormant human capabilities. Hassan had become something of a folk hero in Egypt, his family's guardianship role finally acknowledged by people who had experienced the pyramid's true power. Though official access remained restricted, underground tours of the pyramid's hidden systems had become a pilgrimage for those seeking direct experience of expanded consciousness. Marcus himself had changed profoundly. The night in the activated King's Chamber had left him with permanent access to expanded awareness states. He could sense the electromagnetic fields of other people, communicate telepathically with others who had experienced the network, and access information through methods that conventional science couldn't explain. But perhaps the most significant change was happening at a societal level. The consciousness expansion experienced by millions of people worldwide had created a generation less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of independent thinking, and naturally inclined toward cooperation rather than competition. Political movements based on fear and division were finding it increasingly difficult to gain traction. Economic systems that depended on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire were being replaced by resource-sharing networks organised through enhanced human communication abilities. The ancient pyramid builders' greatest achievement wasn't the monuments themselves, it was the civilization they had made possible. A society where expanded consciousness was the norm rather than the exception, where human potential was fully realised, and where technology served to enhance rather than replace natural human capabilities. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for another day of documenting the ongoing transformation, he reflected on the pyramid's true message. The structure itself had been important, but it was ultimately just a tool. The real power had always been within human consciousness itself, the capacity for awareness to expand, connect, and transcend the limitations that seemed so absolute. The pyramids had been built not to house the dead, but to awaken the living, and after 4,000 years of slumber, humanity was finally ready to reclaim its birthright. Standing in the Prague sunlight, Marcus could sense the presence of others around the world who had experienced the awakening. Through the invisible network that still connected activated sites, he felt their determination to ensure that the consciousness-expanding knowledge would never again be lost or suppressed. They told us the pyramids were tombs, but standing here, I know that's a lie. This wasn't built to bury the dead. It was built to keep the world alive, to preserve and transmit the highest potentials of human consciousness across the millennia, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its forgotten heritage. That time had finally come. The age of expanded consciousness had begun, and no force on earth could put the awakened human spirit back to sleep. The network hummed silently across the globe, connecting minds and hearts in ways that transcended physical distance. The ancient guardian's work was complete. The future of human consciousness stretched ahead like dawn breaking over the desert, infinite with possibility. Marcus smiled, feeling the pyramid's eternal presence in his consciousness, and stepped forward into humanity's transformed tomorrow. The coffee cup trembles in my weathered hands as I speak these words for the first time in 53 years. My name is Detective Raymond Kowalski, retired SFPD, and I'm dying. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. But luck ran out for me the day I opened that damned Alcatraz file. They said Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The FBI closed the case. The warden slept easy. America's most infamous prison maintained its perfect record. But I found things I was never meant to see. Things that made me understand why some truths are buried deeper than bodies. This is my confession. Not of crimes I committed, but of the crime I witnessed. The systematic erasure of 3 men who may have pulled off the impossible, only to disappear into something far worse than death. If you're listening to this recording, it means I'm gone, and maybe, just maybe, the truth can finally surface from the depths where it's been drowning all these years. It was October 1968 when Lieutenant Carson dropped the manila folder on my desk like it was radioactive. 6 years had passed since the escape, and the case was supposedly closed, filed away with all the other solved mysteries that kept the bureaucrats sleeping soundly. "Formality, Kowalski," Carson said, not meeting my eyes. "Washington wants a final review of the Alcatraz evidence. Dot the I's, cross the T's, confirm what we already know. They're fish food at the bottom of the bay." I should have known something was wrong by the way he said it. Carson was a straight shooter, the kind of cop who looked you in the eye when he talked. But that day, he stared at the wall behind me like the words might crawl off it and bite him. The file was thinner than I expected for the most famous prison break in American history. Basic escape details, witness statements from guards, the makeshift raft materials found on Angel Island. Nothing I hadn't read in the newspapers. Too clean, too neat. "Why me?" I asked. Carson finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Because you're thorough, maybe too thorough. They want this done right." He left me with those cryptic words and a growing certainty that this formality was anything but routine. I started with the obvious inconsistencies. The first was a car theft report from Marina District, filed 3 days after the escape. A 1959 Chevrolet, stolen from outside a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, told police she saw 3 men walking away from the vehicle, heading toward the waterfront. When she called out to them, one turned and tipped his hat. "Polite as you please." "They had manners," she told the responding officer. "Real gentlemen. You don't expect that from criminals." The report was buried on page 47 of miscellaneous incident files. No follow-up, no investigation, no mention in the official Alcatraz case summary. Then there was the paddle, a crude wooden oar carved from driftwood, found by a fisherman near Richmond Bridge, 20 miles upriver from where the currents should have carried any debris. The fisherman, Miguel Santos, reported it to park rangers, who logged it as miscellaneous beach debris. No connection made to the escape, despite the timing and craftsmanship that clearly showed prison workshop techniques. But it was the witness statement that made my blood run cold. A night security guard at Fisherman's Wharf reported seeing 3 men in work clothes boarding a small fishing boat around 4 a.m. on June 12th. One of them had distinctive ears, prominent, almost pointed, just like John Anglin's mugshot description. The guard's statement was taken, filed, and apparently forgotten. When I tried to interview him, I learned he'd quit his job 2 weeks after the incident and moved back to Oregon. No forwarding address. "Don't dig too deep on this one, Ray," Carson warned me when I briefed him on my preliminary findings. "Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than a prison break. The Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida felt like stepping into a different century. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the humid air carried the scent of orange blossoms and old secrets. Robert Anglin, the surviving brother, met me on the front porch with the wary eyes of a man who'd been expecting bad news for 6 years. "Federal agents been by here 4 times, he said without preamble, each time asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "My brother's drowned. That's what you want to hear, ain't it?" But his wife, Marie, had different ideas. After Robert went to tend the cattle, she pulled me aside in her kitchen, glancing nervously at the windows. "Christmas cards," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. "Every year since '63, no return address, just signed J&C in handwriting that looks mighty familiar." She showed me a shoebox filled with holiday cards, generic drugstore variety, postmarked from different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Mexico City. The handwriting was careful, disguised, but there were telltale loops and slants that matched samples I'd obtained from the prison records. "Why haven't you told the FBI?" I asked. Marie's laugh was bitter. "You think we haven't tried? First agent said they were hoaxes. Second one confiscated them as evidence. Third one threatened to charge us with obstruction if we kept spreading false hope. These here are copies I made before they took the originals." Photographs came out next. 3 pictures, slightly blurry, showing 2 men in work shirts standing outside what appeared to be a South American cantina. The faces were partially obscured by shadows and hat brims, but the bone structure, the posture, the way one man favoured his left leg, it all matched the Anglin brothers' physical profiles. "Woman from church. Her daughter married a missionary. Sent these from Brazil in '65, Marie explained. Said these 2 Americans worked construction jobs, paid cash, kept to themselves, spoke English with Florida accents. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The man on the left had a distinctive scar on his forearm, a scar I remembered from Clarence Anglin's prison medical records, sustained in a workshop accident at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. "FBI says they're look-alikes," Marie continued. "Coincidence, but a mother knows her son's detective. Even in shadows, even across oceans, those are my boys." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of grief or false hope. It was the fear of someone who knew more than she was saying, someone who'd been warned to keep quiet. As I left the farm that evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked down the country road, 2 figures visible in the front seats. When I drove past, they turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of federal license plates. The Anglins were being watched. After 6 years, the dead men's family was still under surveillance. That night in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd gathered so far. The car theft, the paddle, the witness statements, the cards and photographs. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Together, they painted a picture that made my hands shake as I wrote my preliminary report. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't drowned in San Francisco Bay. They'd made it to shore, stolen transportation, and somehow managed to disappear into the wind. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether they'd survived the escape. It was why the government was so determined to pretend they hadn't. The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. has the kind of institutional grandeur designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I walked through its marble corridors in November 1968, carrying my credentials and a growing list of questions, I felt exactly as intended. The records clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallor of someone who spent his days in basement filing rooms, greeted my request with practiced bureaucratic indifference. Alcatraz escape files? Let me check the catalogue. He disappeared into the labyrinthine storage system, returning 20 minutes later with a puzzled frown. That's odd. The primary files show as transferred to federal custody in 1964, no longer available for review. Transferred where? Doesn't say. Just lists the authorization code. Project Paperclip Archive classified. Project Paperclip. Even a street cop from San Francisco knew that designation. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II. Why would an escape case be filed under intelligence classifications? What about the secondary files, witness statements, evidence logs? Another search, another apologetic shrug. Also transferred, same authorization. I spent 3 days in Washington, following leads that turned to smoke and asking questions that generated only nervous silence. At FBI headquarters, my request for case consultation was politely denied. At the Bureau of Prisons, I was told the relevant personnel were unavailable for comment. Even my police credentials and Lieutenant Carson's authorization letters seemed to carry no weight. It was Agent Patricia Hendricks, a bureau analyst I'd worked with on a previous case, who finally gave me the truth over drinks in a Georgetown bar. She waited until we were alone, until the other patrons had cleared out, until even the bartender was busy with inventory in the back room. "Ray, you need to drop this," she said quietly, her usual professional demeanour replaced by genuine concern. "The Alcatraz case isn't cold. It's radioactive." "What does that mean?" Patricia glanced around the empty bar before continuing. Internal memo came down in 65. Any agent pursuing Alcatraz leads beyond the official drowning conclusion would be transferred to Alaska or worse. 3 agents have been quietly reassigned since then. Good agents, career agents, all because they asked too many questions about 3 supposedly dead men. Why? If they drowned like the report says, what's the threat? Her laugh was hollow. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? All I know is that certain people in very high places want Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers to stay dead, and they're willing to destroy careers to keep it that way. She slid an envelope across the table. I couldn't get you the files, but I managed to copy some of the index pages before they were sealed. Names, dates, reference numbers. Maybe you can piece together what we're not supposed to know. The documents were fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. Cross-references to CIA front companies, mentions of asset recovery protocol, transfer authorization signed by officials whose names I recognised from the intelligence community. Most disturbing was a memo dated July 1962, just 1 month after the escape. Subjects may possess operational value. Recommend immediate field assessment rather than standard fugitive protocols. Operational value, not the language you'd use for bank robbers and car thieves. That night, in my Washington hotel room, I called Lieutenant Carson to report my findings. The conversation was brief and cryptic. "Ray, you need to come home. Now. I've got leads here, Lieutenant. Real leads." The leads will be there when you get back, if you get back. There are people asking questions about your questions, and those people have resources we don't. Come home." The line went dead. I packed quickly, checking the hallway twice before leaving my room. During the taxi ride to the airport, I noticed the same black sedan in my mirrors that had followed me from the archives building 3 days earlier. Back in San Francisco, Carson met me at the airport personally, something he'd never done before. His first words were a warning. "Your hotel room was searched yesterday. Professional job. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but they wanted you to know they'd been there." As we drove through the city, he filled me in on developments from my end. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who found the paddle, died in a car accident outside Portland last week. Single vehicle collision on a straight road, clear weather, and Mrs. Hutchins, the lady who saw the car theft, moved to Phoenix, left no forwarding address. Her old neighbours say federal agents visited her the day before she left. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone connected to evidence contradicting the official narrative was disappearing, voluntarily or otherwise. The Alcatraz case wasn't just closed, it was being actively suppressed by people with resources and authority I couldn't match. "What do I do, Lieutenant?" Carson pulled over and turned to face me. In 30 years of police work, I'd never seen him look so serious. "You write a report confirming the drowning theory. You file it properly. You forget everything you've learned, and you pray that's enough to keep you breathing." But I couldn't forget. The faces in those photographs. The fear in Mary Anglin's eyes. The systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Somewhere out there, the truth was buried so deep that powerful people were willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden. The question was whether I was brave enough, or stupid enough, to keep digging. Tony the Fish Marconi wasn't the kind of informant you'd find in a police procedural manual. A small-time smuggler with ties to both San Francisco's waterfront and various federal agencies that preferred not to be named, Tony survived by knowing when to talk and when to disappear. When he agreed to meet me at a dive bar in North Beach, I knew the information would be worth the risk. "You're playing with fire, Detective," he said, stirring his whiskey with a nicotine-stained finger. "The Alcatraz thing? That ain't just a prison break, that's connected to some heavy government business." "What kind of business?" Tony glanced around the dim bar, noting the exits, the other patrons, the bartender's attention. Old habits from a life lived in the shadows. "You ever hear of something called the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Private contractors, black budget operations, the kind of people who make problems disappear for Uncle Sam. Word on the street is they were running recruitment out of the Bay Area in the early 60s, looking for specific types, intelligent, adaptable, morally flexible, men who'd already proven they could operate outside the law." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying Morris and the Anglins were recruited?" "I'm saying Morris had an IQ of 133 and a talent for planning that impressed even the prison psychologists. The Anglin brothers were mechanical geniuses who could improvise solutions from scrap metal and determination. During the Cold War, those were valuable skills." Tony drained his whiskey and signalled for another. "Think about it. 3 men plan the perfect escape from America's most secure prison. They disappear without a trace, despite the biggest manhunt in federal history. Either they're criminal masterminds beyond anything we've seen, or they had help. Professional help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with new identities, transportation, and assignments in places where questions aren't asked. South America was crawling with intelligence operations in the 60s. Cuba, Chile, Brazil. All potential flashpoints that needed experienced operators who couldn't be traced back to Washington. The theory was insane, but it explained the evidence I'd uncovered. The systematic suppression of information, the classified file transfers, the fear I'd encountered at every level of government. If the Alcatraz escape had been a recruitment operation disguised as a prison break, then admitting the men survived would expose a covert program that violated everything America claimed to stand for. "There's another possibility," Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Maybe they weren't recruited. Maybe they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Such as... Alcatraz was more than a prison, Detective. It was a research facility. Mind control experiments, interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical trials. The kind of work that required subjects who couldn't complain to their congressman. What if Morris and the Anglins saw something during their time there? What if their escape wasn't about freedom, it was about exposure? My mind reeled with the implications. If the escapees had witnessed classified experiments, their capture wouldn't result in a return to prison. It would result in permanent silence. I've heard whispers, Tony continued. Black sites in Nevada, facilities that don't appear on any government maps, places where inconvenient people go to be forgotten, the kind of places where 3 escaped prisoners might end up if they knew too much. He finished his second whiskey and stood to leave. One more thing, Detective. You know why they call it the Prometheus group? I shook my head. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The gods punished him by chaining him to a rock where eagles ate his liver for eternity. Some gifts come with a price that never stops being paid. After Tony left, I sat in that dim bar for another hour, trying to process what he'd told me. 3 theories, each more disturbing than the last. Theory 1. Cold War recruitment. The escape was facilitated by intelligence agencies looking for deniable assets. Morris and the Anglins were extracted, given new identities, and deployed to international hotspots where their criminal skills could serve national interests. Theory 2. Witness protection in reverse. The men had seen classified activities at Alcatraz and escaped to avoid being silenced. Their continued existence threatened to expose government programs that officially didn't exist. Theory 3. The darkest possibility. They were captured alive after the escape and disappeared into the black site system, spending the rest of their lives as test subjects or interrogation practice for intelligence agencies that viewed them as expendable assets. Each theory explained the evidence I'd gathered. Each theory justified the extreme measures taken to suppress the truth. And each theory meant that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced something far worse than drowning in San Francisco Bay. They faced erasure from history itself. 6 months later, against direct orders from Lieutenant Carson and my own better judgment, I found myself on a flight to Rio de Janeiro. The lead had come through Tony Marconi's network, a bartender in Ipanema who claimed to remember 2 American men matching the Anglin's description, regulars at his establishment from 1971 to 1978. They paid cash, spoke little Portuguese, and never talked about their past, the bartender Carlos told me through a translator. But they were different from other expatriates, more careful, always watching the exits, never sitting with their backs to the door. The description matched surveillance training, the kind of operational security taught to intelligence assets. Carlos produced a photograph taken during a Christmas party in 1975. A grainy image showing 2 men at the edge of the celebration, their faces partially obscured but their body language unmistakably American. My hands trembled as I studied the picture. The man on the left had the same jawline, the same ears, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd memorized from Clarence Anglin's prison files. The other figure showed signs of premature aging, stress lines and grey hair that suggested a life lived under constant tension. What happened to them? I asked. Carlos's expression darkened. They left suddenly, in the middle of the night. One day they were here. The next day their apartment was empty. The landlord said men in suits had come asking questions the week before. Americans, but not tourists. Government men. I spent another week in Rio following leads that grew colder with each passing day. The apartment building where the mystery Americans had lived was scheduled for demolition, its records mysteriously lost in a fire. The bank where they had allegedly maintained accounts had no record of American customers from that period. Every trail ended in convenient dead ends and missing documentation. On my final night in Brazil, I was approached by a man claiming to be a freelance journalist who'd been investigating the same story. We met at a beachside cafe in Copacabana, the sound of waves masking our conversation from potential surveillance. "You're the American detective asking about the Alcatraz escapees," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I neither confirmed nor denied, waiting for him to continue. "I've been working this story for 3 years," he said, following reports of American fugitives throughout South America. "The trail is real, detective, too real. These men lived here, worked here, built lives here. But every time I get close to proof, the sources disappear, witnesses relocate, documents vanish. I've had my hotel room searched, my phone tapped, my sources intimidated. He slid a manila envelope across the table. This is everything I've gathered. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, hidden in different locations for 3 years, copied and recopied to prevent loss. It's yours now. Why? Because I'm done. Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men with American accents and no identification. They politely suggested that my investigation was endangering people I cared about. They showed me photographs of my sister's children playing in a park in Sao Paulo. Very clear photographs. Very recent photographs. The envelope contained a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records showing regular deposits to accounts held by men with obviously false Brazilian identities. Employment records from construction companies that had hired American workers without proper documentation. Hotel registries with signatures that bore striking resemblances to handwriting samples I'd obtained from Alcatraz. Most compelling was a photograph dated 1976 showing 3 men at a construction site in the Amazon basin. 2 matched the Anglin brothers' physical descriptions. The third was older, lean, with the kind of penetrating stare I remembered from Frank Morris's mugshot. All 3 wore work clothes and hard hats, looking like ordinary labourers except for their distinctly American postures and expressions. But like every other lead I'd followed, this one ended in frustration and fear. When I tried to contact the construction company, I learned it had been dissolved in 1979. The site where the photograph was taken was now underwater, flooded by a dam project that had relocated the entire local population. The pattern was always the same. Evidence of survival followed by systematic elimination of that evidence. Either I was chasing ghosts or someone with vast resources was staying 1 step ahead of every investigation. My flight back to San Francisco was delayed by mysterious mechanical problems. During the 6-hour layover in Mexico City, I noticed the same 2 men in different locations throughout the terminal. Always at a distance, always watching, never making direct contact. When I finally boarded the plane, they weren't among the passengers. Lieutenant Carson met me at San Francisco International with news that made my blood run cold. Federal marshals raided your apartment yesterday, Ray. Warrant signed by a judge I've never heard of, for evidence in a case they wouldn't specify. They took everything. Your files, your notes, your photographs, everything connected to Alcatraz. In the car ride home, he handed me an official-looking document. Transfer orders, effective immediately. You're being reassigned to the robbery division. Your Alcatraz investigation is officially terminated. On whose authority? Authority high enough that questioning it would end both our careers. Carson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Ray, I've been a cop for 28 years. I've seen corruption, cover-ups and conspiracies, but I've never seen anything like this. The pressure to shut you down is coming from levels of government I didn't know existed. He pulled over in a secluded area of Golden Gate Park and turned to face me directly. Whatever you found down there, whatever you think you know, it's not worth your life. These people have made careers disappear for asking the wrong questions. They can make people disappear too. As he spoke, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past us, its occupants clearly visible through tinted windows that somehow allowed us to see their faces while hiding their expressions. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, our conversation monitored, our future actions carefully noted. That night, alone in my ransacked apartment, I realised the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just a cover-up of a prison escape. It was the systematic suppression of a truth so dangerous that the most powerful government in the world was willing to destroy lives to protect it. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't just escaped from Alcatraz. They'd escaped into a shadow world where truth became enemy of the state, where survival meant accepting lies, and where the greatest prison of all was the silence that surrounded their fate. But silence, I was beginning to understand, has its own way of speaking to those willing to listen. 25 years passed like pages torn from a calendar and scattered by the wind. I worked robbery division, collected my pension, and tried to convince myself that some truths were better left buried. The Alcatraz case became a ghost that haunted my dreams. 3 faces staring at me from the depths of San Francisco Bay, asking why I'd abandoned the search for their story. Then came January 2013, and a letter that changed everything. The History Channel documentary was running old Alcatraz footage when the phone rang. It was my former partner, Jimmy Chen, now working cold cases for the FBI. His voice carried the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. "Ray, you need to see this. Someone sent a letter to the Bureau claiming to be John Anglin. Says he's dying of cancer, wants to make a deal. Information about the escape in exchange for medical treatment." My hands shook as I read the photocopied letter Jimmy brought to my house that evening. The handwriting was shaky with age and illness, but certain flourishes matched the Christmas cards Marie Anglin had shown me decades earlier. The details were specific, accurate, insider knowledge that only someone who'd lived through the escape could possess. "It's a hoax," Jimmy said, watching my reaction. "Has to be. FBI handwriting analysis says inconclusive. Could be authentic, could be someone who studied the case extensively." But I knew better. The letter wasn't just about the escape. It mentioned details that had never been made public. References to guard rotation patterns that were classified. Descriptions of cell modifications that weren't in any official report. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd lived through those final months of preparation. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "The letter mentions a meeting place, coordinates in the Bay Area, where supposedly Frank Morris left something hidden before the escape. Information that was too dangerous to carry. The writer claims it's still there, waiting for someone brave enough to look. The coordinates led to a section of Angel Island State Park, near the spot where the makeshift raft materials had been found 51 years earlier. Against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I found myself hiking those trails the following weekend, searching for something I couldn't name. It was hidden in a cave that didn't appear on any park maps, sealed behind rocks that looked natural but showed tool marks when examined closely. A waterproof container, military surplus from the 1960s, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Guard schedules from Alcatraz, annotated with personal notes about corruption and smuggling operations. Photographs of prison officials meeting with men in expensive suits who didn't appear in any government directories. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to wardens and guards who lived far beyond their official salaries. Most damning was a handwritten journal in Frank Morris's distinctive script, documenting what he'd witnessed during his time at Alcatraz. The prison wasn't just housing criminals, it was housing witnesses to government activities that violated constitutional protections. Political prisoners who'd been disappeared from the mainland. Foreign nationals being held without diplomatic notification. Test subjects for psychological experiments that would later be revealed as part of the MKUltra program. The final entry, dated 2 days before the escape, was prophetic in its certainty. We're not breaking out to be free, we're breaking out to stay alive. What we know, what we've seen, makes us more dangerous to them than any criminal they've ever housed. If we stay, we disappear quietly. If we escape and get caught, we disappear loudly. Our only chance is to vanish completely and hope the truth survives us. The documents explained everything. The official insistence on the drowning theory, the suppression of evidence, the systematic elimination of witnesses. The Alcatraz escape wasn't a crime to be solved. It was a national security incident to be contained. Morris and the Anglins hadn't just witnessed classified activities. They documented them, created a record of government crimes that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Their escape was both an act of desperation and a gamble that someday someone would be brave enough to tell their story. Reading those pages in the dim light of that hidden cave, I finally understood the true scope of the self-destruction paradox. The very actions taken to hide the truth had preserved it. The efforts to silence witnesses had created evidence. The attempts to erase history had documented it in detail. But understanding the truth and proving it were different challenges entirely. The men who'd orchestrated the cover-up were dead or retired, their crimes protected by classification systems and institutional amnesia. The witnesses were gone, scattered or silenced by 5 decades of systematic intimidation. Yet the letter kept haunting me. Someone claiming to be John Anglin, dying and desperate, reaching out across 50 years of silence to offer one final revelation. The FBI had dismissed it as a hoax, but their dismissal felt too quick, too certain, too reminiscent of the patterns I'd seen decades earlier. Late at night, when the pain in my chest reminded me of my own mortality, I wondered about the fates of 3 men who'd gambled everything on an impossible escape. Had they found freedom in the jungles of South America? Had they lived out their days under assumed names, carrying secrets too dangerous to share? Or had they been caught, disappeared into black sites where their knowledge died with them? The letter writer claimed John Anglin had survived into the 21st century, living with the weight of knowledge that could never be shared, watching as history branded him a criminal, while the real criminals wore badges and held office. If true, it was a torture more cruel than any prison cell, to know the truth and be unable to speak it, to carry justice in your heart while injustice wore your name. I kept the documents for 6 months before making my decision. They couldn't stay hidden. Too many people had died to protect these secrets, and too many others deserved to know the truth. But releasing them publicly would accomplish nothing except getting me killed and the evidence destroyed. Instead, I chose a different path. I copied everything, hid the copies in locations scattered across the country, and left instructions for their release upon my death. If the government wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to do it posthumously, when I could no longer be intimidated or eliminated. The original documents I returned to their hiding place on Angel Island, along with my own written account of the investigation. Future generations might find them, might understand what they represented, might finally give Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers the justice they'd been denied for over half a century. But justice, I was learning, was a luxury the living could rarely afford. It was a gift we could only leave for the dead, a truth we could only speak when our own voices had been silenced. The morphine makes it difficult to focus, but I need to finish this recording while I still can. The doctors say hours now, maybe a day if I'm stubborn enough to fight the inevitable. I've been fighting for 78 years. What's one more battle against the darkness? I've spent 53 years carrying the weight of what I learned about Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. 53 years of waking up in cold sweats, wondering if today would be the day federal agents knocked on my door with a permanent solution to my inconvenient knowledge. 53 years of looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror, and jumping at unexpected phone calls. The truth is a heavy burden when you're carrying it alone. I don't know if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived out their days in Brazilian freedom, sipping caipirinhas on Ipanema Beach and laughing at the federal agents who'd spent decades searching for their corpses. I don't know if they died namelessly in some government facility, their final words lost in soundproof rooms designed to swallow screams. But I do know this with absolute certainty. They didn't drown in San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The evidence was always there for anyone brave enough to look past the official narrative. The car theft, the witness statements, the photographs from South America, the Christmas cards signed with familiar initials, each piece individually dismissed as coincidence or hoax, but collectively forming a picture of survival that powerful people needed to deny. The government's insistence on the drowning theory wasn't about maintaining Alcatraz's reputation or protecting prison security. It was about hiding activities that violated every principle America claimed to represent. The research programs, the intelligence operations, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all of it justified by national security classifications that turned constitutional protections into classified waste paper. Morris and the Anglins weren't just criminals who pulled off the perfect escape. They were inconvenient witnesses to state-sanctioned crimes, men whose continued existence threatened to expose a shadow government that operated beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Their escape became their crime, their knowledge became their death sentence, their survival became a national security threat that required decades of cover-ups, intimidation, and murder to contain. I've left evidence of everything I'd discovered, hidden in multiple locations protected by legal arrangements that will trigger automatic release upon my death. Some truths are too important to die with the men who discover them. The morphine is winning now, and the room is getting darker. But before I fade away, I want to leave you with this final thought. Alcatraz was never escape-proof because its walls were too high or its waters too cold. It was escape-proof because the government made survival more dangerous than imprisonment, freedom more terrifying than captivity. The greatest prison isn't built with stone and steel. It's built with silence and fear, with official denials and convenient accidents, with careers destroyed and witnesses disappeared. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't die in San Francisco Bay. The Bay didn't kill them. The silence did. And silence. Silence is the strongest prison of all. But even silence eventually comes to an end. Recording ends with the sound of steady breathing that gradually grows fainter, until only the mechanical hum of hospital equipment remains. Found among Detective Raymond Kowalski's personal effects, along with detailed instructions for the release of sealed documents and recordings. To whoever finds this recording and follows the trail I've left behind, my name was Detective Raymond Kowalski, badge number 2847, San Francisco Police Department. I died on December 20th, 2021, at 3:17 a.m., alone except for the ghosts of 3 men whose story I spent a lifetime trying to tell. If you're reading this, it means the legal mechanisms I put in place have been triggered. Safety deposit boxes in 7 different states will have been opened. Law offices in 4 different cities will have released sealed documents. Digital files stored in multiple secure locations will have been automatically transmitted to journalists, historians, and government oversight committees. I've spent 53 years preparing for this moment, the moment when my voice could finally break the silence that has protected one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. The documents you now have access to represent only a fraction of what was hidden. For every piece of evidence I managed to preserve, dozens more were destroyed by people who understood that truth was their greatest enemy. But what remains is enough. Enough to prove that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape from Alcatraz. Enough to demonstrate the systematic suppression of evidence by multiple government agencies. Enough to show that the official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect state secrets more valuable than human lives. I need you to understand something. The men who orchestrated this cover-up weren't comic book villains twirling their mustaches in shadowy rooms. They were patriots in their own minds. They believed that protecting classified operations was more important than acknowledging 3 escaped prisoners. They convinced themselves that national security justified any level of deception, any amount of witness intimidation, any degree of evidence suppression. They were wrong. In a democracy, truth cannot be classified indefinitely. Justice cannot be postponed forever. The families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers deserve to know their fates. The American people deserve to know what their government did in their name. History deserved an accurate record, not a convenient fiction. I've carried this burden alone because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, my reputation, my life. Afraid of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disgruntled cop. Afraid that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except getting me killed. But fear, I've learned, is just another form of prison. And like Alcatraz itself, it's only escape-proof, as long as you believe the walls are stronger than your determination to break free. To the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, your loved ones were not the criminals history has made them out to be. They were witnesses to government crimes who paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. Whether they found freedom in South America or died in government custody, they deserved better than 50 years of official denial and systematic character assassination. To the government officials who will undoubtedly attempt to discredit these revelations, your time is over. The men who created this cover-up are dead. The operations they were protecting have been declassified or exposed through other channels. The only thing your continued denials accomplish is further damage to public trust in institutions that have already lost too much credibility. To the historians and journalists who will investigate these claims, be careful, be thorough, be brave. The people who killed witnesses and destroyed evidence may be gone, but the systems they created to protect state secrets remain in place. Truth-telling is still a dangerous profession in America. To Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, wherever your final resting places may be, your story is finally being told. Your truth is finally being spoken. Your silence is finally being broken. You escaped from Alcatraz on June 11th, 1962. You survived the waters of San Francisco Bay. You lived beyond that night, whatever your ultimate fates may have been. History will remember you not as the criminals who failed to escape, but as the men who succeeded too well for the government's comfort. Your greatest escape wasn't from prison. It was from the official narrative that tried to erase you from history. That escape, at least, was permanent. Final statement for the record. I, Detective Raymond Kowalski, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby swear under oath that every statement in this recording and its accompanying documents represents the truth as I discovered it through my official investigation into the Alcatraz escape of 1962. I have knowingly risked my career, my safety, and my life to preserve this information. I have done so not for personal gain or professional advancement, but because I believe that in a democracy, truth belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who find it inconvenient. If my death occurs under suspicious circumstances, if these documents are somehow suppressed or discredited, if this recording mysteriously disappears, let it stand as evidence that the cover-up I've documented continues to claim lives. But if this message reaches you intact, if the truth I've preserved finally sees daylight, then maybe, just maybe, the strongest prison of all has finally been breached. The silence is broken, the truth is free, and Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers can finally rest in peace, knowing their story has been told. Badge 2847, signing off for the final time.